Hello everyone, this is Gene and I'm back with another video. Hope everybody's well. It's just about 7:30 in the morning on Friday here in New York City. And I saw this tweet by a regular commenter, follower of mine on Twitter and YouTube, who goes by Sindel's cat. And I really wanted to share this message because I think it is so true and I think it really highlights one of the many problems that we have today, especially when it comes to conversation about gender and all the things relating to gender, like gender identity or gender roles, or even relates, to the whole, King Valkyrie thing that I addressed in the last video, right? Because the thing about all this is that it all has a ripple effect. It all has a domino effect, right? So I just really thought that this would be an excellent message to send. And I wanted to share something positive, right? I'm usually sort of being a critic, right? Expressing what I dislike about something. So I figured I would share something positive. So Sindel's cat says, so I feel like our society is completely divided on masculinity and femininity. On one hand, you got people who are more left leaning, trying to push the narrative that traditional masculinity and femininity are inherently bad. And you got people who are right leaning who think, and this is the second tweet, men who do lean more toward femininity and women who do lean toward masculinity are not needed in society at all. When I would argue that they are just as needed. I would argue that we need all four to contribute to society as they are all needed. Yes, you are absolutely correct, Sindel's cat. You are absolutely correct. The problem is that whether you're on the right or the left, whether you're more liberal or progressive, right, or like me, you're not terribly attached to gender roles, right, or you're more traditional, the problem is that you're kind of, when you get to the extremes, right, you're in a very damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situation. And the thing is that even though the extremes are different, they're similar in that they try to take something as complex as not just gender identity, but one's personal identity, right? And they try to boil it down to a few things, and then they pretty much come up with a stereotype of, oh, all people who are like this are of this orientation, or they're trying to do this, or they're trying to do that. Like, let's start with the left. And here's the thing. I have issues with the left and the right. I have issues with liberals and conservatives. I tend by nature to be a centrist, so I kind of look at a lot of stuff and go, "Y'all both stupid," for various reasons. But I think I'm gonna start with the left because I think their extremism is a bit more prevalent or a bit more noticeable, right? Because of how so much media is liberal, right? The people who make the media tend to be more liberal minded, or they're of the liberal parties. So it's like their extremism sort of is what gets more attention than necessarily the conservative liberalism that say got more attention in like the 80s and 90s. But again, it, the extremes are bad. I want to be clear. There is nothing wrong with uh, being a traditional man or woman, however one defines that. Even that definition of what a traditional man is or what a traditional woman is going to vary depending on where you live, what culture you grew up in, and even the time period that you grew up in, right? Because both sides, both extremes, I should say, both extremes don't seem to understand or don't seem to care is that things like gender identity, personal identity, gender roles, gendered expectations change throughout time, right? What was once seen as obscene, right, or just on sort of like the fringes of acceptable behavior in society becomes mainstream as time goes on. And usually this is a result of youth culture, right? Because the thing about youth culture is that it's very brief because people get older, right? And so as youth culture changes, standards of decency and normalcy change. For example, in the 1910s and 1920s, right, the idea of the flapper, right, a woman smoking a cigarette or a woman wearing pants would have been seen as very gender bending, very controversial because those were seen as masculine. Right now, today, decades later, right, over 100 years later, or about 100 years later, a woman smoking a cigarette or a woman wearing pants is seen as normal, right? There's not a lot of gender significance attached to that anymore, right? Even women having tattoos or lots of tattoos, right? That's very popular among both sexes these days. For a lot of people who are not like bikers or pro wrestlers or in any sort of group where like tattoos were always sort of part of the deal, right? It's popular for many people to have not just like one or two tats, but like entire sleeves covering their arms and covering their necks and covering their bodies. Right? It used to be sort of just stuff again like bikers or musicians or pro wrestlers or stuff like that. You just have to be part of those certain groups within those like subcultures. But now it's just normal, right? Plenty of people do it. It's probably more uncommon these days to not have a tattoo than it is to have one, right? The stigma around tattoos has died out over the years because it's become more accepted. It becomes more accepted because largely of youth culture, right? So, as I was saying, that was kind of a tangent rant. But as I was saying, right, the problem is that if you let's again take with the left because they're sort of the ones who have the hyper focus and get more attention because they're the ones who want to change things, right? You take somebody like me, who is admittedly a tomboy, dyed in the wool tomboy, right? Even my name, right? My name in French translates as John. Not that I chose my name. I'm actually named after my grandmother, but right. I am by admission a very masculine woman. I'm a tomboy. I have been since I was about 4 years old. Like I said in the other video, my mother got me a Barbie doll. I tore the doll's head off, and I wanted Rock'em Sock'em Robots. And I am not ashamed of the fact that I am a tomboy. I take great pride in that. It is as much a part of my personal identity as my religious faith, as my being a New Yorker, or anything else. But the thing is that also means I'm a woman, right? I have a masculine bent. I am more in touch with the masculine side of myself, right? I think in like Jungian psychology that would be referred to as the animus, right? But the fact of the matter is that I'm still a woman. The fact that I have masculine or more prominent masculine traits in my personality or more masculine interest does not automatically mean that I'm not female, right? Nor does it mean that I am at odds with my gender, right, or my gender identity, right? Even when I had a lot more hangups about it when I was a child, I was never at odds with my gender. I was never at odds with being female. I was at odds with and uncomfortable with being made to be feminine. There's a difference. I never denied the fact that I was a girl or that now I'm a woman. What I hated was the expectation put upon me to be a girly girl because that wasn't me, right? It's still not me. And I actually do wear skirts now when I have to. But it's never been me. It probably will never be me. I am not a terribly feminine woman, right? And that's fine. The problem is that in today's highly polarized, especially internet culture where everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame, the problem is that if I were growing up today, if I were 5 or 6 instead of 37, in the year 2020, 2022, right? People, especially like parents or teachers or whatnot, who are sadly becoming more and more radicalized in some ways, They would not look at my masculine leanings and think, oh, she's a girl, she's a little girl who likes dude stuff. They would look and go, oh, she's trans. And this is how her transness is expressing itself. It's like, no, I'm not trans. Nothing against trans people, but I'm not trans. I'm not a guy trapped in a woman's body. I'm just a masculine woman, right? At times, it ain't all that deep, you know? You know what I mean, right? Like these days, I would be referred to, especially as a little kid, where I was much more insistent about it, right? I would be referred to as trans or gender queer or gender non-conforming. The only one of those that would actually apply would be gender non-conforming because I'm not a feminine woman, right? So that one would apply, but otherwise the other two would be entirely extreme, right? And imagine attaching this very extreme label that even adults don't quite understand yet to a 5-year-old just because she likes Thundercats and thinks Lion-O is the coolest thing ever. I still like Thundercats and think Lion-O is the coolest thing ever, right? And that's the type of thing that I really worry about when you have these extremes, right? When you have these polar opposites, is that, especially when we're talking about little kids, they try to impress these very extreme, rigid, inflexible definitions onto people, especially developing humans who don't understand it yet, right? Like, another example, I'll use myself as another example. When I was about, I would say between the ages of like 11 and 13, so about preteen, going into teen years, I sincerely believed I was asexual, right? That was a sincere belief I had because my definition of sexuality at that age was defined by what I saw from other people in my age group, right? I was very close to my cousin at the time, and my cousin, especially back then, was the polar opposite of me, right? Like if I'm the sulking, brooding, uh, nearly silent, you know, uh, brooding tough girl. It's like if you were to use Teen Titans, it's like I was Raven, she was Starfire, right? And and the thing is that I based my understanding of sexuality at that time, or of orientation, on what I saw from her and her group of friends, right? So her group of friends, right, were interested in boys and they had boys in class that they crushed on or they had celebrity crushes and all that stuff. So when I compared myself to her at that age, I thought, oh, well, I don't have, there's no boy in class that I have a crush on. It's like, I have one or two that I'm kind of cool with, that I'm friendly with, but none of them I have a crush on, right? There's nobody in the media that I have a crush on. I mean, this is the age of like Marilyn Manson and stuff like that. So I'm like, oh, okay. Well, from what I've been told, asexuality is when you don't like anybody in that way, right? So I must be asexual, right? That was my understanding of it. A very simple, linear understanding, right? That was based entirely not in my own preferences or my own understanding, but in what others had told me and the cues that I took from other people in my social circle. I had based it around others. I didn't base it around myself. Would have known to do that. I was a kid, right? But imagine someone telling me at that age that this is how I will always be, right? How I will always identify, right? That at a 12-year-old, it's stuck in stone, right? Now, of course, I realized as I got older, and especially as I started watching more and more pro wrestling, and I saw men like Shawn Michaels in Playgirl magazines, I realized no, I'm not asexual. I have a type. I'm a heterosexual woman. I just have a type, and I happen to crush on men who will never be obtainable to me, right? But I sincerely fear that if I were again, at that age in the modern day, They that people, even if they are well-meaning, would try to attach this label on me and say this is how you will be for the rest of your natural life, and that's not true. A lot of people, whether they're straight or not, struggle with their sexual identity, right, when they're teenagers because they're still figuring it out, right? And then, of course, you have other things you have to factor in, like parental influence, societal influence, religious influence, right? A desire for acceptance, right? So it can be a very complex thing. And we live in a society where if you show any signs of being what pop media would determine as queer, right? Or just anything that is not traditionally masculine or traditionally feminine, you are immediately labeled as part of the LGBTQ community, and that will never change, right? If a little boy likes playing with Barbie dolls, he must be gay, right? Who cares if he grows up and he gets married and all he ever dates is women, right? And he never shows a attraction or preference to men. Well, he was just in the closet, right? He was just in denial. People don't want to accept the fact that there are certain elements of yourself that might be at odds, right? But that do not cause a personal conflict, right? Being male and liking Barbie dolls, right, which is a traditionally feminine thing, does not automatically mean one is gay. Could it be a sign? Sure. There are a lot of people who are like, oh my god, I knew I was gay when I was like 4 because I like Barbie dolls. And there are plenty of guys who were like, you know, I was made to play Barbie dolls with my sister. Or guys who just like Barbie dolls, right? And it's no indication of their sexuality. The thing is that these type of issues are both more complex and more simple than the people who like to sit on the extremes um, uh, like to believe it is, right? So there's that. And then, of course, you have the conservatives. And I want to be clear. This is not to say that all conservatives view things this way, nor that all people who are more progressive and liberal minded view things this way. I'm speaking about those at the extremes. I want to be clear about that. But you then have the other side of it, right? The conservatives, right? Your Candace Owens types, your Ben Shapiro types, who have a freak out anytime they see a man in a dress, right? Especially when it's like a musician, right? It's like, musicians for decades have been using their own personal image, right, to challenge gender norms and like you're surprised, right? I even did a video about this like a year or two ago when the Owens and the Candaces of the world were freaking out over Harry Styles wearing a dress, talking about it was some sort of attack on masculinity. No, it's not. It's not an attack on masculinity. You know what's an attack on masculinity? Ads like that Gillette ad from a few years ago. That's an attack on masculinity. Constantly making guys the bad guys, right? Not displaying a sincerely bad or evil person who happens to be male, but I mean just taking elements that are generally associated with the masculine, right? Maybe being assertive or being a bit more rational, right? Not as emotional or things like that, right? And immediately labeling those as toxic, not just different from, say, more feminine traits, but as toxic, as bad, which they're not, right? Rationality or not being as emotional or being more sporty or anything like that is not inherently bad, right? What makes something toxic is not the thing itself, right? It's how people use it or how they express it, right? It's like the elements, right? The same fire that cooks your food can burn your house down. I have personally experienced both. Life is not always kind to me. right? But it's a matter of how it is used and how it is expressed, right? The same strength, that, or take weapons, right? The same gun that a person can use to stop an intruder, right, or to stop a crime, or to protect themselves, can be used to harm others. It is not the fault of the gun. It is the fault of the person using it, right? And masculine and feminine traits and the expression of those traits, in my opinion, are pretty much the same, right? If a man is abusive toward someone else, towards someone who is weaker than him, it is not toxic masculinity. His physical strength, right, or his ability to commit violence is not in and of itself toxic masculinity. His willingness to abuse people weaker than himself make him a toxic individual who happens to be male. That does not mean all men, because they have are generally stronger than women, right? That does not mean that all men are going to be like him just because there's a certain shared trait, right? If that makes any sense, right? So those, in my opinion, right, taking elements of masculinity and deeming them bad because they exist, deeming men bad because they exist, right? That to me is toxic masculinity. That is the type of thing I will always, denounce, because men are not inherently bad, at least no more so than any woman, right? I am not more or less toxic, for example, than my brother. Believe me, my brother can mention plenty of things that I've no doubt done wrong in life, or done him wrong by, right? And I could say the same thing about him, and he could probably bring up many times where I've been, you know, good toward him, and I could bring up times when he's been good toward me, right? Because we're humans. I'm not, at least I try not to be, a toxic woman, and he's not inherently a toxic individual because he's a guy, right? What makes us toxic or not toxic is what we do to other people. It's not our like, just existence, right? It's not our existence that makes us toxic or not. It is how we deal with life and how we um, uh, interact with others and how we treat others, right? A strong person generally will not abuse a weaker person, right? Whether they're male or female, right? Because abusing people for no reason is a toxic behavior, right? It has no gender. But anyway, right? I view things like that, right? Just deeming the male existence as toxic. I hate stuff like that. That is toxic masculinity. A man in a dress is not toxic masculinity. I'm not saying you have to agree with it. You have every right to say, "Hey, I don't think that's right." That's okay. But stop deeming it something that it isn't just because you don't like it. It's not an attack on masculinity. Same way it wasn't an attack on masculinity when the Red Hot Chili Peppers did it. Hell, the Chili Peppers used to perform next to naked, only having a sock over their penises, right? But it's not an attack on masculinity, right? Same way it wasn't an attack on masculinity when you see multiple people in media, right? This goes back decades. Cross dressing, like Martin Lawrence used to do it all the time. In Martin and in several movies he was in back in the day, Big Mama's House and all that stuff. Tom Hanks, right, did a lot of roles early in his career where he cross dressed, right, and many other shows, right, or again the androgyny of like glam rock stars in the 80s, or Prince, right, in particular, right? Those to me at least were not attacks on masculinity. Those men were not saying you can't be a traditional manly man, right? That you must be like us. They were just expressing themselves, and their expression of their masculinity was a bit more femme coded, and that's okay, right? It certainly didn't hurt Prince's chances with the ladies, or the glam rock stars, they still got plenty of women at their rock concerts and plenty of women in the backstage. They could tell you stories, right? They could tell you stories, right? So again, that's what bugs me about conservatives. They or these type of conservatives, I should say. These extreme conservatives, right? They will take something, especially when it's done in secular media, which already like sort of exists to like give the finger or thumb their nose at what is deemed traditional or conservative anyway, and they're very open about that, right? But they will take anything that is that does not fit in their very narrow box of what traditionally masculine or traditionally feminine is, and they will label it as an attack on the very notion or idea of femininity or masculinity, right? Uh, Especially when it comes to fashion, and it's like if you know the history of fashion, and this is what got so many people heated at Candace Owens when she complained about Harry Styles in a dress. It's that it's like if you know even the basics, right? Just the casual knowledge of fashion, you'll know that what's masculine and feminine has been has changed over time, right? The whole idea of like pink being female and blue being masculine 100 years ago was flipped, right? Blue was the feminine color, right? True blue, loyalty, and all that. Pink was the masculine color because it's red mixed with white, right? So red, represents these macho things like war and blood and sex and all of this other stuff, right? And babies, right? Little babies, right? Used to be dressed in what we would deem today as like very feminine clothing up until they were at least around their toddler years. Then maybe they would get more gender specific clothes, right? But it wasn't uncommon back then for like a male child to have like very long hair, which is often seen as a more feminine trait, right? So these things tend to, again, they're fluid, they change over time, and you'll have your very rigid extremist conservatives in this regard who will either who either don't seem to know their history on how these things change, or they just don't care, right? And the thing is that, in my opinion, if you are too rigid or if you don't care about how these things change, then guess what? Certain things that you do, like for example, Candace has worn pantsuits, right? A pantsuit in the modern day on a woman is not seen as a gendered thing. But that wasn't always the case. Just a few decades ago, right, a woman would have been um, uh, chided for wearing a pantsuit, right? Because it's an offshoot of a man's business suit, right? So it was seen, especially like in the 80s, right? The whole rise of the career woman, and you're kind of like, Murphy Brown, ball buster types, right? It was seen as this like, or it was categorized as this like, very aggressive, masculine um, um, fashion, right? Now, today, with the exception of perhaps with a few different women, mainly in politics, but generally speaking, nobody really takes a strict, hardline, gendered stance about a woman in a pantsuit, right? She's just a woman in a pantsuit, right? That sort of like gendered identity with it has pretty much died out. Same with pants in general. But again, few decades earlier, you would have been a maverick if you were a woman wearing pants because that was seen as masculine, right? Why aren't you in a skirt? Aren't you a proper woman? I don't think Candace or those like her in this regard would appreciate being told that they are unfeminine just because they wear pants. But they'll do the same thing or have a tendency to do the same thing to others who don't fit their own very rigid definition of what masculinity uh, and and femininity is, right? So you have the conservatives who want to hold on too tight to traditional notions and who don't know or don't acknowledge how even what we deem traditional masculinity and femininity has changed over the years. And then you have the liberals, the progressives, who want to tear it all down, right? And that's the problem. Two entirely different extremes, but they do the same thing, right? The outcome more or less is the same. They attack a person's sense of identity, right? And it demonizes, it damns that person's sense of identity because it doesn't line up with their definition of what a man or a woman is, right? And again, I want to be clear, I'm talking about extremes. Whereas most people fall in the middle somewhere. Maybe some are like me and they lean more toward the masculine element of their personality. Some may lean more toward the feminine, right? These things change over time in your life. But that's the problem with extremes. They try to trap people in these very rigid, inflexible boxes and attach these labels to them for life, right? You can't be a real woman. You don't wear a skirt. You don't like skirts, so you're not a real woman. You're just a man trapped in a woman's body. You should transition. You'd be happier. Both of those are stupid. If I wear a pair of pants, you know what I am? A woman in pants. That's all it is. I am no less female because I wear a pair of pants, and I'm not a man trapped in a woman's body because I wear a pair of pants. I am a woman in pants. That is literally it. That's all it is. Nothing more, nothing less. Right? If a man wears his hair long, right, it doesn't mean that he's a trans woman and he's beginning his transition. It could be for a very small amount of people, but for the majority of men who wear their hair long, they just wear their hair long, right? They're not denouncing their masculine identity. They're not women trapped in a man's body. They just like having long hair, right? Like I said, it's overly it is something that the extremes of this make overly complicated and overly simplify. Overly complicated because they remove all of the nuance, and overly simplify because they just, again, because of the lack of nuance, they just say, "Oh, you fit ABC. Here's your tag. This is who you are. Have you and who you have always been for life. Have fun." And it's like, no, you don't get to define me, right? You don't get to tell me who I am just because my existence or my way of being does not mesh with your clearly um, uh, small minded and inflexible notions of what masculinity and femininity are. I am who I am. I am what I am, and that's all that I am. And if you can't handle that, well then, sigh about your damn luck. Whether you're on the extreme liberal side or the extreme conservative side, I would say that perhaps you should actually talk to people and get to know them as people before you put a label on them just because they do things or they exist in a way that is outside of your very binary understanding or idea of what a man and a woman or um, masculine and feminine is. And again, if you are very traditional, right, that's cool too. You can be that. If you're totally non traditional, that's cool too. You can be that. Most folks are somewhere in the middle, and you can be that too. There is room for everyone at the table. We've just got to stop putting stupid labels on people and get to know them as people instead of just very rigid ideas, right? That are just going to change in another few years anyway because youth culture is always coming and going. My youth culture is now old, right? And now there's a new youth culture, and eventually that youth culture will age out, and a new one will will rise, and so on and so on and so forth. Right? So all this to say, this was an awesome 2 tweets by Sindel's cat, and you got a 35-minute rambling rant out of it. So thank him. Thank him for this. But anyway, that's the video. Please let me know what you think, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a good day and night wherever you are.